The Cat Opera by Grady Roper. Out of habit and nervous fidgeting, Cena's thumb rotated the clicking wheel of the camera's film advancer. "Don't do that," snapped Polly. "What difference does it make?" she retorted, with a disappointed air of realizing this vacation hadn't brightened her husband's spirits as she had hoped. "'Cause the camera will go off in your bag and waste a shot." She looked at the disposable camera in her hand, and then out the tram window, past the absinthe bars, fabric shops, and kebab stands, and wondered what eating dinner alone every night was going to feel like. Cena's father had fallen in love with the sidewalks of Prague, the patterns of black and white and pink granite. "They remind me of Mother's quilt club parties," he would reminisce. "It's the patterns." He had photographed all the different variations of the cobblestones on his visit to Prague in the 1960s. Elaborate mosaic designs, meticulously creating squares, crosses, diamonds, blocked in outline with a mesmerizing array along nearly every pathway. Cena had grown up with the stories of Father's visit and how the patterns held the history of each street like a secret code, similar to her grandmother's patchwork quilts, in which every scrap of fabric had been saved and sewn into majestic quilts. Remnant fabric pieces, from living room curtains to the couch reupholstering to some special clothes made for Aunt Bertha's second wedding, found new meaning. These quilts contained more history than the grand family photo taken in 1940, before all the elder Gladden brothers flew into World War II, never to return. Prague was only bombed once during the war, and supposedly by mistake. When the Germans first invaded, the Czech people surrendered immediately in order to keep from having their most beautiful city devastated. The Alliance forces had also spared the city, understanding the Czech people were not really Nazis, but just caught in the crossfire. However, one night, while an American bomber plane was on its way to Dresden, the crew saw the large metropolis of Prague and, mistaking it for their target, proceeded to drop a series of bombs across the city. Cena's grandfather, who was stationed in Italy at the time, just happened to be in Prague that night. As chance would have it, he was found in the rubble and counted among the dead. No one quite knew why he was there. He wasn't supposed to have been there. His official army record listed desertion at time of death. It was a family mystery, or at least a family secret that had been kept from her. Cena's husband, Polly, had known for months that something was not quite right with his stomach, but didn't want to go to the doctor or even acknowledge it to himself, much less Cena. Knowing it was serious, he preferred pretending it was nothing rather than accepting the fact that his family's long history of terminal stomach disorders would indeed include him. His father had died at the age 33 when Polly was only 8 years old. Polly didn't have any kids, not yet at least, and now it seemed like it would stay that way. Cena had discovered a bloodied handkerchief and confronted him, and then forced him to see a doctor to confirm what he already suspected: terminal. Polly's seriousness had begun after his father's death and had continued through college. It was one of the things that Cena had appreciated about him when they first met in their early 20s. Polly's seriousness had begun after his father's death and had continued through college. It was one of the things that Cena had appreciated about him when they first met in their early 20s. Polly seemed focused and sincere, more like a man and less like a boy. They only dated for 4 months before Cena suggested they should get married, and he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Sure, why not?" Their first dates had long stretches of silence, and though it felt a bit awkward, she decided it was preferred to the usual chatter of nonsense to which she had grown accustomed. And as she became more comfortable sitting quietly beside him, she began to hear the cat opera again. The cat opera was something like angelic singing that Cena sometimes heard in her head. It had happened periodically throughout her life, but more so in her youth. She first heard this cat opera as a young child with her family cat, and had assumed that this cat possessed special powers of communication and was sending these sounds because of all the affection Sina had shared with it. She was sure the cat could actually talk if it wanted to. All cats could, but they had decided to never reveal the secret to the humans. Sina considered these singing sounds to be their secret communication pact. She would spend hours caressing the cat and listening to the pretty music. It sounded like a cat singing opera from far away. But actually, it wasn't just the family cat, because the singing began happening at other times as well. Her first boss had been a soft-spoken elderly man who ran a small bakery. They would work together for hours with not a word spoken between them, rolling tortillas, folding empanadas, cutting cookie shapes. All the while, she listened to the opera music that always accompanied feeling comfortable and safe with someone. He would smile at her occasionally and gesture with a nod to a pan ready for the oven, or to alert her to a customer at the front desk. The cat opera became something she trusted and believed in. After marrying Polly, she heard the music all the time, or at least any time they were together. Even at night, while she lay beside him and he slept, the opera played. Soon she barely even noticed it. What she noticed was when it wasn't there. Over the past year, she had heard it less and less. "We should stop off for a coffee," Sina suggested, trying to clear the anxious mood between them. Without looking over at her, he replied, "Sure, why not?" They had been riding the tram with no real destination in mind, just riding around the full loop of different lines as a way of seeing the city. A poor person's version of the tourist buses. They hated the real tourist buses, mostly because of the other passengers. The old city center had been invaded by capitalism, and all the ancient buildings were now full of awful corporate shopping. Sina and Polly weren't there to be tourists, nor to shop. They were there to take photos of the sidewalks and to try to enjoy each other's company. The tram pulled up to a plaza stop with a park on one side and an old church across. The bells were ringing. "Let's get off here, yeah?" They exited the bus and walked across the grassy area of the park. Many people were enjoying the afternoon sun, and even more were relaxing in the shadows of the enormous trees. Young lovers cuddled, little children sat with their grandparents, young men with their liters of beer and packs of cigarettes lounged, a woman read a book, and many people napped on blankets with their shoes off and arms folded behind their heads. Amongst all the beautiful people were others in less picturesque states. One ragged, middle-aged man they walked past was sprawled out in the grass, as if he had fallen there sometime earlier in the morning from too much alcohol or heart attack, and hadn't moved since. Sina stopped to look at him for a moment. "You think he's dead?" A sideways glance and shrug was Polly's response. They found a coffee stand, and each ordered a shot of espresso. "You know, when my dad was here in the 60s, he visited Kafka's grave, and there was a beetle stuck on its back, kicking its legs around, just like the opening scene of Metamorphosis." "I know, Sina. I've heard that story 100 times. She stared at him blankly, then turned her eyes to the park. A few preteen girls were looking at the maybe-dead man lying in the sun. They seemed to be calling out to him, but were afraid to get too close. The man remained unresponsive. "Look at those kids, Polly. They must think he's dead, too. Wouldn't it just be awful for all these people to be having such a lovely afternoon, while in fact there could be a poor dead man, just dead, there in the middle of it all?" "He's probably just still passed out drunk from last night. These people love to drink, maybe even more than folks back in Philly." The young girls continued to get closer, inspecting the man. Finally, one of the girls picked up some leaves and tossed them onto his face. At this he stirred, swiping away what he thought was a bug. He rolled over on his side and resumed sleeping. The girls ran off giggling. "Oh, thank God," sighed Sina. "Or maybe you should just thank those young girls for enlightening your dark fantasy." And with this quip, he cracked the first little smile she had seen from him all day. She thought about the traveling they had done together years ago, when he was happier and an adventurous companion. In those days, they would slowly walk past the cafes full of people drinking coffee and guess at their conversations. It wasn't so hard to see how people felt about each other. Sometimes not hearing the words being spoken between two people or not understanding the language makes it easier to see how they really feel about each other. The way they look at each other and the subtle expressions are often more telling than the spoken words. Sina would point out a sophisticated-looking woman with a younger man, and Polly would explain how it was Shirley the boy's boss's wife, and how their love affair was being terminated over a café au lait. The boy's explaining how, now that she had taught him to be a great lover, he wanted to go try it with girls his own age. He knows this will really get her goat, but the real reason for the split is because he had noticed her flirting with a few customers in the shop, and he didn't want to be dumped by a married woman, and so he was taking action to break off the affair first, as a way of saving face, defense through offense. You see, this young man was a brilliant basketball player in school, but now he uses basketball philosophy to guide his real life. He seems to think life is a competitive sport. When, at this moment, the young man leaned back in his chair, and with the used paper napkin he had been shaping into a perfect sphere while talking, he tossed it straight into the empty glass sitting in the middle of the table. Polly's eyes bulged in disbelief at the sight of this. His hands shot into the air and he yelled, 3 points! Did you see that? Sina laughed along in surprise, and Polly winked at her. But they both could see the young man inside the cafe was not smiling, and the older woman had left the table. Another game they would play involved riding the long escalators of the subway. They had discovered that handrails move at a slightly, almost imperceptibly different speed than the actual steps. When first mounting an ascending escalator, if one firmly plants themselves in position with their hand on the rail beside them, and without moving it, they will find themselves, by the time the top is reached, leaning way forward, uncomfortably and exaggerated. And the opposite was true when riding down. Picture someone leaning into a very strong wind, or someone who just stepped off the tilt-a-wheel ride. It was a secret game, without words, just glances between them and broad smiles as the shifting occurred. Sina missed this fun-loving companion. Across the way, an old man was playing accordion on the sidewalk, an old traditional folk song that continually repeated the same refrain of the melody. Nobody walking past realized the man had been playing the same thing for half an hour. They each only got about 1 minute of the tune. It was a slow dirge, moody and beautiful. Sina pointed out to Polly how interesting it was to watch how the music affected the walking of the passers-by. A professional gentleman, approaching at a brisk pace, without even looking towards the musician, slowed his steps until he was actually walking in time with the music. A crying child was distracted from its woes, turning its head towards the man, while the wailing began to add a lyrical element to the song. A woman shifted her pace to the song's tempo, while her ponytail swung back and forth as if conducting an orchestra. The musician's spirit affected everyone around him, without most of the people even noticing, but to watch from afar, the pattern was clear and romantic. A street musician I knew in college said he would keep track of how many direct looks and smiles people gave him while he busked. He determined how successful his day was not only by how much money he made, but by how many people he connected with. Ha, like Karma Cash. Yeah, something like that. We should give that old man a couple of euros. Oh, you mean kronas. Yes, and kind eyes as a tip. I don't feel much like smiling. The coin should be enough. Sina and Polly relaxed in the park for another hour, absorbing the sounds, feeling the breeze, soaking in the autumn sun, their hands and fingers slightly touching. Sina wondered about her grandfather, and whether he had relaxed in this same park with a forbidden lover before he died. A tear coursed down her cheek, and she was not sure if it was intended for the grandfather she had never met or for Polly. She liked how a single, slow tear felt like a gentle caress, like a reassuring touch of a sweet friend. It actually made her smile, and she sat up to look at her husband. He remained motionless, with his eyes closed. She could tell he was in intense thought, because the little wrinkles on his brow were knitted, and she could see the rapid movement of his eyeballs behind the closed lids. She watched him quietly and was already missing him. She wondered what the funeral would be like. They had talked about it a little, but he refused to participate much. "Just keep it simple," was his only suggestion. She shook her head and rolled her eyes. "Anyway, funerals are for the living." "Hey, you ready to go?" "Sure." They decided to walk back towards their hotel and search for more sidewalk patterns to photograph. That's why they had bought the disposable camera in the first place, to reproduce all the black and white photos from Sina's dad's travels, but with color film. Sina had planned to give this to her father as a Christmas gift. They meandered slowly, exploring the smaller side streets without much conversation, but she didn't mind. She could feel her grandfather's presence in the city, and she felt her father's presence in the patterned granite designs of the sidewalks, and she felt Polly beside her, fading into silence. That so familiar cat opera was getting quieter and quieter. She slowly advanced the film, clicking the plastic wheel on the disposable camera, ready for the next shot. And that was The Cat Opera by Grady Roper. This book was designed and laid out by Mr. Mark Calvary. His project is called The Carbon-Based Mistake, and he's out of New York City and creates amazing work. Check out his website if you'd like. And stay tuned for one final little special feature after this moment. Thanks.